Good morning, everyone. It's good to see so many folks that are carving time out of this busy season to learn all about early voting by mail. I am a co-chair of GoVoteNYC. My name is Pat Swann. I'm a senior program advisor at New York Community Trust. We have a lot to get to this morning on the topic of New York State's early vote by mail legislation, and more broadly, the role of vote by mail in the roster of democracy building strategies. But before we get started, there's three important things that I want to make note of. First, this discussion is part of an ongoing series of learning sessions organized by GoVoteNYC. GoVoteNYC is a coalition of foundations that are committed like a laser to increasing the abysmal situation with voter turnout in New York City. And we're also now looking at ways to support Albany-focused, Albany-focused reform to improve voting access for voters across the state. Sorry about that. So I want to start. I'm proud to be a GoVote co-chair along with Martha King at Revson Foundation and Sabrina Colazzo at New York Foundation. And I want to start by thanking all of our GoVote members, the funders, and our community partners, our grantees. Second, as with all GoVoteNYC sessions and all of our funded activities, this is a nonpartisan conversation. Given the times we live in, that can sometimes be a challenge, but I'm sure that we're all up to it, and I will hold you all to it. And finally, we are committed to ending promptly at 11:25 due to a prior commitment by. So there's a lot to get to and not a whole lot of time. And I will start with a few questions for our panel, then we'll open the discussion up, at which point we'll go to questions and comments in the chat box. And I'll also try my best to acknowledge any virtual raised hands in the audience. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip lengthy bios and just jump right into quick introductions of our panelists. Susan Lerner is Executive Director of Common Cause New York, which is the New York chapter of the national organization that I'm sure we're all familiar with, known as Common Cause. And full disclosure, New York Community Trust is a supporter of Common Cause from time to time on various things, though not specifically on vote by mail. Bishop Dwayne Royster wears a couple of hats. He is Executive Director of Power Interfaith and the Power Action Fund, and he is the board chair for PA Voice, Pennsylvania Voice. Andrew Garber is counsel for the Voting Rights and Elections Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. And so let's start with you, Andrew. Vote by mail is new to New York, but it's not so new elsewhere. Could you talk about the different types of vote by mail systems that have been enacted or are being considered by states in other parts of the country?
Absolutely. First of all, good morning, everyone. It's nice to see a lot of people here, and thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be part of this conversation. So as you noted, vote by mail is newer in New York, but a lot of different states in the country have been using it, in some cases for decades. And there's a few different ways they've implemented it, a few different systems. And before I dive into the specifics of those, I do want to make one key point, which is that voting by mail is one really important component of how people should be able to vote, but it works in harmony with a full election system. So it's important that states have robust vote by mail options so that voters who want or need to take advantage of it are able to. But it's important that it be contoured to the needs of the particular communities within a jurisdiction. And so, for one example, in some Native American communities, they don't have traditional addresses that I'm sure many of us here use to interact with the Postal Service. And so those are the important types of considerations that be taken into account And maybe something like a vote center on a reservation, if a state allows it, is the right solution for that community. But vote by mail, absentee voting, I'm going to use those kinds of terms interchangeably this morning. So forgive me if I go back and forth a little. As I said, is a key element of a voting system for a lot of voters. And there's a few reasons for that. Some people might have an illness or a disability that makes it hard for them to get to the polls. But for a lot of people, it's even simpler than that. Life is really busy. Voting is a fundamental right. It's something everybody should have access to. And while I work an office job, if I need to come in an hour late because I was at the dentist, I'm able to, but that's not a luxury everyone has. Some people work multiple jobs. They have hourly wages. They need to get there. They can't be late. They can't give up that hour's wage. They have children they're taking care of. They need to get off to school, or other family care responsibilities that can make it hard to get to the polls. A lack of transportation, particularly in suburban and rural communities, can be hard for voters. And so vote by mail is a solution for some of those challenges that people may face. And so that's one of the reasons it's so important it be an option for everyone and not just certain voters, and that it be convenient and accessible. There be sufficient time to request a mail ballot. It's not a really tight window where someone has to do it. So diving into some of the different types of voting by mail system we see across the country, the first and most comprehensive is what's known as an all-mail election. It tends to be states more on the Pacific coast of the country that do this, but as it sounds, it's a system where all registered voters, by default, for every election, are sent a mail-in ballot. They don't have to request it. They don't have to sign up for anything. Just in advance of the election, if they're registered to vote, they're sent that ballot. There are still in-person voting sites available for those who wish to take advantage of them in those types of elections. But the default is everyone will vote by mail. There have been some studies about how this affects turnout. They tend to have pretty wide ranges of outcome. There's no specific number where we can say turnout goes up this amount if a state transitions to an all-mail election, but a lot of them do hover somewhere in the range of about 5%. So it seems they make an impact when states make that change. The states that use an all-mail election, Oregon was the first. They've been doing it for over 20 years at this point, so they have a bit of a history with it. But during that time, other states, including California, Colorado, Hawaii, Nevada, Utah, Vermont, and Washington, have changed to do all-mail elections. And it's been something that's been useful for the voters in those states. Additionally, sometimes states, or more commonly local jurisdictions, will send mail ballot applications to all voters. That's a little bit different. If anyone here has voted by mail, at least when I've done it here in New York, you fill out the form to request the mail ballot, send it in, or bring it to an elections office, and then you, assuming you're eligible to get it, receive the mail ballot as a second step. So some local jurisdictions, especially in 2020, sent the applications to all registered voters. Some states actually forbid that. They don't allow their counties and cities to do that. So I think that's worth knowing as well. The second type of mail voting system seen in a lot of states, in fact, this one is in about half the states, is called no excuse absentee voting, or no excuse vote by mail. And that's where all registered voters can fill out the application to request a mail ballot, but they don't receive that application or any ballot by default or as a matter of course. It's something they have to affirmatively ask for. Many states, though, do make it easier in a couple ways. For example, they might have a permanent mail voter list. We're able to sign up one time and say, I would like a mail ballot for all future elections. Or they might have like a year-long mail voter list, where if you sign up for an absentee ballot, you request an absentee ballot in, say, March for a primary, you can check a box and say, I also want one again in November for the general. And that way you don't have to fill out the application again. Unlike in the universal vote by mail states, voting by mail tends not to be the dominant form of voting. We've certainly seen in the last few years, people have gotten more comfortable with it. The number of people voting by mail has gone up. But again, I do want to emphasize the importance of having things like sufficient polling places, well-staffed polling places, lots of early voting, because people also do like taking advantage of those opportunities as well. And then finally, a number of states still use what I call excuse required mail voting. And so in that case, not all registered voters are allowed to vote by mail. Only registered voters who meet certain criteria are able to. Everyone else has to continue to use, go in person on election day or go during an early voting period. So people in these states who are eligible to vote by mail tend to be older voters. In a lot of states, they allow people over 65 to request a mail ballot. Voters who are dealing with an illness or disability. Often, if someone knows they're going to be out of the county on election day, for example, for a pre-planned work trip, they're able to request a mail-in ballot. Similarly, students who go to school outside of the county are often able to, as well as people who might have a religious observance on election day and so wouldn't be able to attend the polls. It's a more restrictive policy. It means a lot of voters in the state aren't able to use this convenient form of voting, even though they might have a need that isn't recognized in the law. I talked about those at the top. It can be really hard to get to a polling place. You lack transportation. You need to get your kids off to school. You need to get to your job. You're not able to get there and potentially stand in a line. And then the last thing I want to say about mail voting, and then I'll turn it over to my fellow panelists, is that all evidence shows that voting by mail is safe, that it's reliable and effective. To give you one example of that, in 2020, Texas, like many other states, greatly expanded their use of voting by mail during the pandemic. People weren't as comfortable going to the polls. And following that election, the state attorney general's office had his workers spend over 20,000 working hours investigating for evidence of fraud in the 2020 election. After all of that work, all they found was around 15 people had written the wrong address on a form. So even with a relatively rushed expansion of vote by mail, there was no evidence, despite a lot of looking, that it led to any sort of widespread fraud. There certainly hasn't been evidence that any fraud in mail voting has changed the outcome of any elections. I mentioned before, Oregon has the longest history of universal vote by mail. A study that looked at their mail voting situation from 2000 through 2020 found that over 100 million mail ballots had been returned from voters. They found about 12 cases of fraud. That's around 1 in 10. So, while people can understandably have some concerns about the safety and reliability of mail voting because there is a period where the ballot is being handed off, ultimately, there's no evidence that any sort of widespread fraud is taking place. With that said, safety and security are absolutely essential for all elections. So if states increase voting by mail, they should definitely be taking a number of steps to make sure it remains reliable and the confidence of the voters remains high. A number of things they can do, a number of safeguards they can put in place, including some sort of ID verification. For example, people might write a social security number or driver's license number on their ballot, barcodes on all mail ballots to make sure it's known that the right person is receiving and returning it, ballot tracking in conjunction with the Postal Service so people always know where their ballots are, secure drop-off sites, which can be at county offices or locked drop boxes are often helpful and convenient for voters, as well as things like post-election audits. Those are always important when done right, to have both electronic and paper trails to be able to verify all the votes. And as always, penalties for people who violate the law. So while safety and security of mail voting is just as important as it is for all other types of voting, and there are a lot of great election officials out there making sure these changes and these safeguards are in place, appeals to fraud should be no reason to limit mail voting or to cut off people's access.
All right, there's a lot in there. And so we will circle back, I'm sure, to some of the really interesting points and observations you've made. But next, let's move on. And Bishop Dwayne, that you'd like to share that was produced, I believe, by Pennsylvania Voice, PA Voice. And so I'll let you cue that up. But if you'd like to first set it up for us, please take a couple of minutes to set up the video for us.
Thanks, Patricia and Neil, for the invitation to come and share. And hello, everybody. I do have some friends out here from Faith in New York. I just want to shout them out real quick. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge their presence. They are colleagues in the Faith in Action Network. So thank you so much. I'm Dwayne Royster, Executive Director of Power Interfaith. I do serve as the board chair for PA Voice, but I'm speaking and primarily my role as the Executive Director of Power today and for the work that we did in partnership with PA Voice and other organizations around the state of Pennsylvania with regard to mail-in ballots and no excuse ballots. Pennsylvania prior to had a absentee ballot, which you had to have an excuse for. And Andrew really went through all of those things. So I'm not going to repeat that again about why we had to do that. But in 2019, the state legislature passed what was called Act 77 that then gave us no excuse mail-in ballots. And we began to do work on that. In just so happened they passed it in 2019. And in 2020, we really needed it. I want to show a video that we use to do some education work with people around how to do mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania. There's some very specific requirements in Pennsylvania that can sometimes be very complicated. And so we started making videos. Now, we're a faith-based organizing movement. These are videos that we produced ourselves. But it really goes through the explanation process about how to do a mail-in ballot. We felt the need to use trusted messengers because at that time, there was a lot of confusing information coming out about how to do that. And so we got information from the state, and we worked to create these messengers for people of faith and moral courage to be able to hear these from trusted messengers about how to use the how to use the mail-in ballot. So I'm going to show this video. It's only a couple of minutes, and then I'll come back and talk a little bit more about the impact of this. Yeah.
Tuesday, November 8th is Election Day, and your voice deserves to be heard. If you plan to vote early, don't forget the following.
Read all instructions and mark your ballot with a blue or black pen. Don't forget to check both sides of your ballot. There may be other candidates or issues on the other side.
Seal your ballot in the inner secrecy envelope marked Official Election Ballot. Do not write anything or make any marks on the secrecy envelope. You must seal your ballot in this envelope for it to be counted.
Place the sealed inner secrecy envelope in the pre-addressed outer return envelope. Sign and date the voter's declaration on the outer envelope.
Return your completed ballot to your County Board of Elections office, either by mail or by hand delivery.
All mail ballots must be received by your County Board of Elections by 8 p.m. Tuesday, November 8th. Mail ballots received after that time, even if postmarked on by 8 p.m. Tuesday, November 8th, will not count.
You can hand deliver your ballot by the deadline to a drop box or satellite location if your county provides one. A list of drop boxes and satellite locations will be updated on the Department of State website as information from counties becomes available.
You are the only person permitted to return your ballot, unless you have a disability and have designated an agent in writing to return your ballot.
What if you change your mind and want to vote in person on November 8th? Take your mail-in ballot to your normal polling place and turn it in, and they will tell you how to vote in person.
Don't be afraid to ask questions. If you're unsure about anything, reach out to your County Board of Elections or the Secretary of State. Remember, we've come too far to turn back now.
Awesome. So we use that video in our election cycle. And again, we made a plethora of videos. This is a part of our Black Faith Votes campaign. And it was particularly targeting communities of color, African-American communities in Christian and Muslim areas with trusted messengers. And we did a series of these to be able to speak to the various communities about how to do vote by mail. Again, there was a lot of litigation that occurred at the beginning of the 2020 cycle around this act. And so there was a lot of misinformation out there. So we needed to really speak to that. Now, I just want to highlight a couple of quick facts here for a moment. And as Andrew mentioned earlier, Pennsylvania, he didn't talk about Pennsylvania specifically, but Pennsylvania you had to have an excuse to be able to get an absentee ballot. And I just want to drop some numbers for you so you have an idea of this. In 2016 election, in the total in the state of Pennsylvania, there were 262,000 absentee ballots. It was 4.2% of the electorate that year. In 2018, which was the midterm election, there was 195,000, only 3.7% of the electorate used absentee ballot. In 2020, there was 2,637,000 mail-in votes that turned in. It was over 50% of the ballots that were turned in that year. And even in 2022, as we were coming out of the pandemic, we had 1 million mail-in ballots that were issued, and it turned out to be almost 33% of the electorate that year, that the folk that voted at the statewide level. So we're even seeing now that vote by mail has become an important tool. We should note that 2020 was the biggest election in Pennsylvania history ever. And part of that is deeply due to the vote by mail. Now, let me just talk about some quick aspects of the Pennsylvania law that might be different from other places as well. So you actually have 50 days prior to the election to turn in your mail-in ballot. So they have to be released by the county boards of election, mailed out and sent to you, and they have to. You have 50 days to turn it in. The ballots have to be turned in by 8 p.m. on election day, and I think that that's an important piece to understand too. That because there's been some lawsuits, we were actually involved in one of those about people forgetting to date their return ballots. You saw on there, there's an outer envelope that people have to fill out and put in their sign and date, and a lot of people forgot to put the date on there. Their ballots were getting thrown out. We just won a suit with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that basically said if it has to be turned in by Thursday at 8 p.m., what difference does it make the date that it's turned in? So we think that's going to get appealed, but it's an important step in the right direction. And I mean, there were some other things that came out of this bill as well. It added another 15 days for voter registration, which was really powerful, and really was helping all the way around to make it so that people had more access to the ballot. It is still a work in progress. Actually, in 2020, later in 2020 and going into 2021, some of the very same legislators that actually passed this measure were now fighting the measure, I think because of the success of the measure as well in terms of the turnout that occurred in the state of Pennsylvania. It was a battle to get here, and fighting to change election law in Pennsylvania has been an ongoing battle. This is the first major changes that have occurred in decades in the state of Pennsylvania with regard to election law. What it really did was open up the opportunity for people to be able to actually cast ballots that had not casted them before. There is an ongoing education process that has to happen. We've been using social media, we've been using earned media, we've been using paid media to try to get an education piece out there. Just in last year's election in 2023, but in 2022, there was actually published, the state published the list of people whose mail-in ballots were incorrect, either because they forgot to sign it, they didn't date it, and then organizations like Power, Make the Road, PA Voice, and others, the organizations part of PA Voice, actually were scrambling to try to reach those voters to help them what they call cure their ballots, so that they could actually fix their ballots. You can fix it up until 8 p.m. the day of the election. So they were actually able to go to their polling place. They were actually able to reclaim their ballots, fill out new ones, get new ones printed, print out and sign and submit a new ballot. And so we were very, very happy to be able to do that. So vote by mail has actually increased the possibility for people to be able to engage in democracy, to be able to actually have a say in their collective destiny. And we're pretty excited about the work that we've been doing together to continue to make that happen and to continue to increase access to the franchise across the state of Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I say that as a New Yorker who was born in Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania. So I'm glad to see my home state is stepping up in that way. So Susan Lerner, we're ready to hear your take on your description of the early voting by mail act that's now legislation in New York State, and just so that we're all on the same page and understand exactly what this legislation does, please describe it for us.
Okay, so what this legislation does is it sets up a new system, which is distinct from the absentee ballot requirements. So Andrew talked about vote by mail as one continuum. From a legal standpoint, there's actually a distinction between absentee balloting and vote by mail in the state of New York, as in Pennsylvania. And in order to get an absentee ballot, you have to have, as Andrew pointed out, a reason, a specific reason listed in our Constitution. You have a open possibility to get a early vote by mail ballot in New York, but it's not, as Andrew described, a universal vote by mail system. The voter has to let the Board of Elections know that they want to take advantage of this new possibility and get a vote by mail ballot. So there are various modalities that you can use in order to notify the board that you want a vote by mail ballot. And our statute sets up a process where you can request an application for a vote by mail ballot. You get it in the mail, but most importantly, the statute requires that there be a very robust online portal for requesting both your early vote by mail ballot or your absentee ballot. So you go to the same portal. This gives those of us who work with voters a really excellent opportunity to be sure that we can register people on the spot, at our tables, at our meetings, at the door, on iPads. And then if we are talking to people who are already registered, who want to take advantage of voting by mail, that they can do it on their phones, on an iPad. It's a very dynamic system, and it's outlined extensively in the statute to be sure that it's truly robust. And the statute also has protections in it. The bishop talked about the cure process. That's also outlined in our statute in New York, which is heavily influenced by the experience in Pennsylvania. So a lot of commonalities. To be sure that if there is some problem with either the application or the vote by mail ballot as it's returned, that the voter is notified what the problem is, has an opportunity to cure that problem so they're not disenfranchised. It's a very robust, detailed bill that we're very happy to see, because similar to Pennsylvania and basically every other state in 2020, where the states responded to the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic by loosening the requirements to get an absentee ballot, we saw a huge uptick in the number of people who filed absentee ballots when, through executive order, the governor lifted some of the requirements to get an absentee ballot. So we know from experience across the country that having the ability to vote by mail really is a factor which can increase turnout. And also, from an election administration point of view, similar to any form of early voting, it helps spread out the huge number of people who want to vote, particularly in a presidential year, over a longer period of time. So we have less of a logjam on election day. People have more time to consider their choices, fill out their ballot correctly, and return it to the Board of Elections, either by mail or in person, at an early voting location, at the county board. Again, similar to Pennsylvania, by the close of the polls on election day. So this gives voters more choices. We trust our voters to choose our leaders. We certainly can trust them to choose the way in which they exercise the franchise. An argument that voters should only be permitted to vote in one method and not another, frankly, doesn't make any sense to me. If we trust them to choose our leaders, we trust them to choose how they want to vote. And it's our responsibility to make all of those modalities accessible and to educate the voters, like the video that we saw, to their choices, to allow the voter to determine what their voting plan is going to be, whether it's early vote by mail, early voting in person, or voting on election day. So this is an exciting development in New York under the law, and it's going to give us many, many more opportunities to help people to exercise the franchise, to make their voices heard, and to influence the choice of who our leaders are. Now, I'm sure it's not a surprise to anybody on this call that every time we expand opportunities to vote, there's an alarming and upsetting pushback on the part of various political forces that do not want to see more people voting. So that's happened here in New York as well. There is a lawsuit that was filed almost immediately upon the governor signing the bill earlier this fall, trying to argue that this expansion of our ability to vote is unconstitutional. But the bill was drafted very carefully by many of us to ensure that it follows the experience of Pennsylvania and Massachusetts in distinguishing between vote by mail and absentee voting in our state constitution. So just as vote by mail was attacked in the courts in Pennsylvania and in Massachusetts, and that attack was successfully defeated so that voters are able to vote by mail in those two states, we are hopeful that we'll get the same result out of New York's courts, and that they will stand with the voters and ensure that we all have the benefit of as many modalities to vote as our technology safely permits.
Thank you so much. This has been a great start to our conversation. And so thanks to each of our panelists. So I'll repeat that I'm going to start off with a couple of questions, but please be sure to add your thoughts, your observations, your comments, your questions in the chat box. And, in a few minutes, we will get to those and hopefully dig in a little bit deeper on all of these very interesting topics. So my question, the first one that I want to put to each of the three panelists, is a fairly broad one. I know that the data is still not conclusive. It's still coming in many states that have had mail-in voting. But I wonder if you all could take a shot at ranking amongst the whole roster of various democracy building strategies, whether it's same-day registration or some people have proposed a voting holiday. Some people, of course, in New York City, we have ranked choice voting. Range of various democracy building strategies that are out there to put mail-in voting, and I guess more specifically, universal mail-in voting. So who wants to start on that? Susan, do you want to start?
I think this is such an unfair question, I have to say. Trying to decide among really important reforms, all of whom have a benefit for the voter, is really hard. A lot of concern is expressed about low turnout rates in the United States, and we're constantly searching for reforms that will encourage more people to vote. We know that the combination of same-day registration and early voting can have an uptick. But at the end of the day, I guess the question is, what are we trying to achieve? If what we're looking for is an increase in voter turnout, then I would have to say that I think vote by mail, and particularly universal vote by mail, is probably the most effective tool that we have. But there's no one magic silver bullet for turnout. There are a lot of factors that go into that. So that's why I think it's important for us to have all of these reforms. Again, to give the voter the ability to make the voting plan that works for them. But if I had to choose one, I'd go to universal vote by mail.
Andrew?
Sure. Yeah, I really echo Susan's comments there. I think vote by mail is amongst the most important reforms that a state or a jurisdiction can implement if it wants to increase turnout and give all those opportunities to voters. I think I'll add two things. The first is there are so many different changes or either formal policy changes or just things that can be done with more funding to make it easier for people to vote. I mean, from curbside voting for people with disabilities required PTO from employers for voting, a longer early voting period with a lot of open sites. Sometimes you'll see a lot of early voting, but people have to travel far to get to a place where they can exercise it. Vote centers in states that allow them, all sorts of other things that can be done around the margins as well. I don't want to sit here and list things for 10 minutes, but it's important they be done in tandem, because to the second point I want to make here, what we sometimes see is a state will enact a restrictive policy. And they'll make it harder to vote by mail, for example, but then they'll say we've added a day of early vote. And it shouldn't be either or. These things shouldn't be mutually exclusive. And so it's important that if a state expands mail voting, it doesn't cut funding or decrease the number of polling places in cities or towns across the state as well. It's important these things be done consistently and they be done together, because it is one comprehensive system that people should have the ability to use a different part of when it's right for them.
Dwayne?
I would just jump in real quick and say a couple things. And so, I'm a preacher, so y'all forgive me, I got stories. But I think I want to talk about why the vote by mail part is really impactful. And I appreciate Susan also pointing out the universal vote by mail. One of the things that happens in Pennsylvania is that you can actually request for a year. Now, unlike other states, Pennsylvania's got elected every 6 months. Every 6 months there's an election. And so you can literally request that you permanently get your ballot by mail. And you also saw that there's a way to actually turn it in if you actually wanted to vote in person. But there's two things that happen. One, in 2020, my brother got diagnosed with cancer and could not stand in line. And so we were actually able to get his ballot at home, where he could actually fill it out, and then the little declaration, so I could drop it off for him. And I think if that had not existed, he could not have voted. The second thing that we discovered, especially with our immigrant siblings who are citizens, in their ability to vote, for the language barrier, it was actually easier if they had the ballot where they were also with a family member that could explain to them in more detail what was on the ballot. So I think that was English speaker. So I think that that's a very big part of being able to create more access for people to be able to do that. While I do agree with same-day voting, and what I really want is automatic voter registration, so that you turn 18, you're automatically registered. And then when you go to vote for the first time, if you want to in Pennsylvania, you have to declare a party or not one. You declare it at that time and then go past your ballot. But I would love to see that happen. That would make life so much better. But I do think that there's something very powerful about this tool that allows people to take time with the ballot to be able to make their decisions, and then to be able to turn it in a way that allows them to feel like they're really participating in their democracy.
Thank you so much. And Susan, you're right. It was a very unfair question. So, Dwayne, I want to come back to you a little on the experience in Pennsylvania and ask you, here's another unfair question. Is there any funders here in New York, as we anticipate, similar, going through the same journey that you went through, with challenges and so forth and so on, and also in terms of just educating people about what they can now take advantage of in terms of mail-in voting?
Yeah, I mean, and sorry, Patricia, I missed part of the question. You kind of blanked out there for a minute, but I think you're asking if there's anything funders and others can do to help with this. Is that what the question is? Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
share your advice based on your experience for all of us who are traveling the same journey,
Sure.
in New York State.
Yeah, I mean, I would look, there's got to be a lot of education. We had to do a lot of education. And I will go back and say that when we first did this, there was a lot of miseducation going on, right? Some of it intentionally, some of it not intentionally that was happening. People were making mistakes. We were trying to figure this out. There was somebody printed the wrong ballot in one of the counties and they had to go back and redo it. I mean, there's a lot of work around education. And I think we have to use every means possible to be able to do that education work, which is why we produced the video. Because we needed to be able to get to social media. We needed to be able to do something quick that people could easily understand, that they could actually sit there with their ballot, figure it out, stop and start to make sure that they were doing every piece correctly. I think that's absolutely critical. A lot of times I know we want to make sure that we're getting people out to vote, which is good, but that education piece was absolutely critical so much so that now, 2 years in, we can step back a little bit, because the majority of voters, as you've seen in the numbers that I talked about earlier, are now using this and using it on a regular basis, that it sort of becomes sort of ingrained about what you do and about how you go about doing it. But we will continue to need to educate newer voters, whether they're younger or older, but people voting for the first time. We will continue to need to educate voters about this ongoing work. And that's going to take resources and money to be able to make that happen. That doesn't happen overnight. When I think about what we spent, running ads and, doing these videos and making sure we got them out in the public, I mean, it was a significant amount of money when it was all said and done.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I think now we'll turn it over to questions. We'll start with some questions that are in the chat box, and I'm going to rely on Neil Coleman to channel those to us. And before I do that, though, I want to give a special shout out. Neil is the consultant director of GoVoteNYC. He's the man behind the scene of this and all of our learning sessions and all of our activities, and is sort of at the core, at the hub of everything that we do. And stepping into the shoes of Laura Hansen, who many of you know. So I thank you, Neil, and I'm going to turn to you now to shout out a couple of the questions in the chat box.
Okay, thank you, Pat. So there's a few questions from Cynthia. Some of these may be a little too technical for our panel, but I will sort of group them together. And for those that you have, for those that where their answers, go ahead. Otherwise, we can follow up offline. Whether New York will have the counties run the vote by mail in the way that they do in Pennsylvania. Also a question around whether ballots can be forwarded. Apparently they cannot in Pennsylvania, whether they will be in New York, and what kind of voter notification for rejected ballots will be required in New York.
So if I can respond to some of the questions, New York is what we call a bottom-up system. Each county is responsible for running the election. So notifications, the applications will go to the relevant county, and the county will be responsible for providing the early vote by mail ballots. But remember, we've got a robust online system, and the statute as it's currently drafted requires that notification to the voter that you can get an early mail ballot will be in the annual mailing that every voter gets, that has all of the information that you need to be able to vote. We at Common Cause are in discussions with members of the legislature to require a individual postcard and other individual notifications to each registered voter in 2024 that we now have the ability to apply to give the board notice that we want a mail ballot, so that voters are aware of it officially. And then, of course, all of the organizations that work on helping voters, Let New York Vote, New York Civic Engagement Table, all of those coalitions will be doing reach out to voters to let them know. As far as forwarding is concerned, I did a quick look at the bill. The bill is silent on that topic. So I don't really have an answer on that at the top of my head. Have to research that a little more. And the cure process will be what the cure process currently is in New York. It's not going to be a different cure process for mail ballots. It's going to be the same process that we have for absentee ballots, which means that the Board of Elections gives voters notification through different modalities by mail. If they have a phone number or an email, they may use that, and there will be the same different ways in which a voter can cure the problem with their ballot for vote by mail as there is for an absentee ballot. And in some cases, that is the ability to call in and correct the information. So The systems are set up, although they have a very different legal foundation, they are set up in parallel. So it's least confusing for the voter. So that if you are looking for an absentee ballot, you're in the same portal. If you need to cure an absentee or a vote by mail ballot, you'll be using the same procedures, and the board makes that clear.
Oops. Okay, Neil, is there anything else? Another chat question? I was gonna scan. I don't see any raised hands virtually, so
We
I
do
don't
have a
think,
few more. Yeah, there's a few more questions in the chat. There was one on to Bishop Dwayne around funding for educating voters. The bishop answered that in the chat. I don't know, is there anything more you want to say on that, Bishop Dwayne?
Yeah, we kind of took a risk on that one because we were so concerned about the miscommunication. And so there was questions, where do we get the money from? Eventually we have funders that were backing it and the work, but we had to kind of put it together ourselves, show it around to folk, and then everybody wanted to do the legal check to make sure that what we were saying was correct, because nobody wants to back something that's going to cause a lawsuit. And then eventually, as with most civic engagement, the money kind of comes in on the back end. And so we were able to get reimbursed for some of that cost that came out on that. I'm sorry, I had to say it, y'all. It just has a tendency to come late after you've already been doing the work. So we had to, kind of self-fund in that sense. And then, we were able to get money from our partners later on for that.
There's also a question about moving elections to even years, which is something we've done a prior learning session on at GoVoteNYC. So not to take us too off track, but maybe if the panel has anything to say on that that's specifically connected to voting by mail.
Consolidating our elections has a positive impact on every modality, because what we've seen is that it increases turnout for the down ballot races. Common Cause New York is a strong supporter of consolidating elections. We support the bill, which is currently pending on the governor's desk, which would consolidate town and county elections to even years. And we are supporters with Citizens Union of a constitutional amendment which would consolidate all of our elections. The bishop mentioned how many elections there are in Pennsylvania. Let me assure you that we're right in competition with Pennsylvania when it comes to confusing voters with surprise elections. It's a complaint we hear from our members across the state all the time. It's not unusual for me to get a phone call saying, I just found out there was an election yesterday. Why was that? And people are really concerned that it's really hard to figure out when the elections are. Special elections, school board elections, water district elections, town elections, village elections, county elections. Voter fatigue is a real problem. So consolidation is something we at Common Cause New York and many of our partners in the Let New York Vote Coalition are aggressively working towards, because again, we think it helps the voters. And our long-term goal in New York is to center our elections on voters and not on candidates and parties.
Oh. Mark, did you have a question? Uh-oh.
Pat, you froze for a moment there.
I saw a raised hand from Marguerite. Maybe not. Okay.
We also have a question in the chat around ballot tracking as a best practice for voter confidence and security, asking whether New York will be including ballot tracking in their process. That's a question.
There's an extensive there's an extensive section in the new law that requires a very extensive ballot tracking system that's really part of the online application process, so that the boards, the county boards and state board are required to automatically track the requests that they receive for the mail ballots. That is information which would be publicly available, and they are required to make a publicly available online vote by mail ballot tracking system to make that available and have it in place. So I know they're starting to work on that right now, because unless there is a preliminary injunction issued by the court, perhaps as early as later this week, vote by mail needs to be in place for what we anticipate as a special election in Congressional District 3, which is likely to take place in February. So the boards are working on it even as we speak.
Okay. I have a question for Andrew, and I specialize in unfair questions. So here's another one. On a 1 to 10 scale, you know, New Yorkers tend to think that, you know, we're a progressive minded, you know, predominantly blue state. You know, many of us know that's not really accurate. But in your perspective, from your national perspective, on a 1 to 10 scale, how would you rank New York in terms of accessibility for voters, you know, people who are eligible to vote, being able to vote?
It's a very good question, trying to pin me in with the number, of course. I think that I would break it down into two parts and say we need to look both at what are the baseline laws and what are the trends in a state. I would say this for any state you asked a similar question for. New York has been alluded to even just a few years ago, was behind on a lot of these things in terms of accessibility of vote by mail and some of the other reforms we've talked about. So, you know, where is New York at? I think it's behind a lot of states. I don't know that I could give it the highest rating for some of these modalities of voting. On the other hand is the question of trends. And New York seems to be trending in the right direction with, for example, expanding vote by mail in a way that hopefully everyone in the state will be able to take advantage of it who wants to. And so it's a state that's moving in a positive direction. And so it definitely get a good score in that sense, but there are still some concerns. Passing a law is obviously an important step, but implementing it is important too. And we've seen New York have some trouble with implementing some other pro-voter changes it's made. For example, it implemented automatic voter registration when, for example, you go to the DMV. You can be automatically registered to vote at that time, as well as online voter registration. Laws to enact those changes were passed, but the state agencies that are responsible for actually making them happen have been behind. They've missed some deadlines that were in the law. And so making sure they're getting the funding and that these changes are actually happening is another really important step too. And, you know, there are some states, I would say, kind of the opposite in terms of this baseline and trends. Some states that had really good no excuse mail voting policies, for example, that are now tightening vote by mail in a lot of ways, whether it's less time for voters to be able to request a ballot, or voters have to, for example, have witnesses sign under oath that they witnessed the person fill out their own ballot, things like that, that can kind of trim the margins of who's able and wanting to vote by mail.
Okay. I want to go back to Pennsylvania. You had good, you know, statistics documentation of the total number of votes that were mailed in, you know, comparing the elections over the past several years. I wonder, has there been any crunching of that data yet to show the distribution of those, of the mail-in votes? In other words, you know, urban versus rural versus suburban, Western Pennsylvania versus Eastern Pennsylvania, etc.
Yeah, you know, I can't really use the numbers I have because they're Republican and Democrat. So that's really the breakdown more so than anything else. I mean, each county has their own breakdown of that. and unfortunately, I was not able to compile all that for this date and time. We do know that the southeast part of the state, very large, mail-in vote by mail and absentee ballots. A little bit less in the central part of the state. And then, I mean, the western side of the state is not as populous as the eastern side of the state is, but there was significant size amount of vote by mail that came in from that side of the state as well.
Could you, Dwayne, for my screen, you froze a little bit. Could you repeat the last couple sentences?
Yeah, the western side. So eastern side, southeastern side in particular, very heavy. Central, a little bit lighter, but there was still vote by mail folk. And it was actually older folk that used it more so than younger folk did. So we should just say that in the more central areas. And then the western side of the state, there was a decent amount, but the populace numbers, it's not as populated as the eastern side of the state is. And so, but there was still a decent amount of votes that came out of that area.
And so just to kind of keep you on the spot,
sure.
I've always felt that there is a lot more opportunity for advocates of these kinds of voting reforms to partner with organizations and people and populations in rural areas, as well as the people with disabilities, the community constituencies, organizations that fight for various rights for people with physical disabilities on this particular measure. You know, and I wondered if there's any strategy that you're aware of, either with your network or elsewhere, to kind of make those kinds of connections with allies that aren't often seen as natural allies on these kinds of reforms that will make voting more accessible for people, no matter where they live, you know. So, yeah, just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
I mean, Power is a part of PA Voice, which is the state C3 table, right? Which is actually both rural, urban, and suburban groups that are a part of it. There's, I think, almost 70 groups now from across the state. And we have folk like the Center for Coalfield Justice that are in right above West Virginia, in Washington Township, which is Washington County, which is a very lightly sparse rural county. And then you have folk from Philly like Power. And then we work in suburban areas and other parts of the state as well. I mean, I do think that this is a tool that can be used very powerfully. Now, I have to say that some of the rural counties made some decisions to make this more complicated. So in, some of the early elections, some of the counties put out ballot boxes where people could just drop their ballots in the boxes. Some of the more rural counties decided to only have one ballot box, and they put it usually at their county office so that people had to travel a distance to get there, right? And, for lack of a better term, it's a little bit of voter suppression, right? So people would still be able to mail it in, but you didn't have a neighborhood ballot box you could just drop it off, or a local ballot box in your town that you could do it in. You had to actually go to the county, the county seat to be able to do that. And I think that was problematic. And so there was a fight, and we actually did a bus tour around the state, really called Keeping Our Faith in Democracy, really challenging some of those counties about their actions and calling out what they were doing, which was basically turning into a level of voter suppression and not allowing people to be able to vote the ways that they wanted to. One county in particular that was Lancaster County in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is, it's part of, they say it's southeast, it's really more central, but one ballot box, county of 400,000 people that spread out over, hundreds of square miles. And that was very problematic. So, I want to say this is awesome. It's universal. It's wonderful to have the ballot boxes. You can send it in by mail. You can walk it up to your county election office, but there have been folk that have tried to use means to be able to suppress it. And we've seen this in particular in counties that are not as populous and not as urban as others. So there's a lot of work to be done. We're trying to work with everybody we can to help make access to the ballot, much easier and much more fruitful.
Okay, so I'll do one more scan for any raised hands from.
You just muted yourself, Patricia.
Thank you. I'll do one more scan to see if there are any raised hands up. I see Barbara Smith. Okay, you're on.
Thanks, Patricia. I just wanted to take a quick second. I'm Barbara Smith Warner with the National Vote at Home Institute. This is our holy grail. This is what we do, is to promote voting at home in states all across the country. And we're just thrilled to support the work that New York is doing, and also Pennsylvania. As somebody from Erie, Pennsylvania, Bishop Royster, just thrilled to all the outreach I've done there. The folks in Pennsylvania are really utilizing this. And I just wanted to say to you all that all the things that have been brought up today, all very valuable and very important to implementing this well. Susan with Common Cause, I could not agree more with. We really do believe. I happen to be from Oregon, which is how I got involved in this as a former legislator. And our turnout numbers after doing this for 20 years are like, you know, we had the highest turnout in the 2022 elections. And it is part of that. The more you center the voter in the voting, it really is transformational. It's not making the voter go out and find the ballot, find the polling place, turning it in. So I'm very excited. Look forward to supporting and engaging with you all, and just want to say that it really also once you do it, you will want to, once you voted at home, you will want to do it more and more. That's another thing we found, that after 2020, the big spike in voting at home, yes, it went back down, but the difference from 2018, only about 20% of all voters in the US voted at home, and it was up to 32% in 2022, while early voting stayed about the same, went from 17 to 18%. So just really excited to see all of you here engaging and supporting this really important change in your voting rights. And thank you. Thank you for organizing this call as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Neil, I understand you have a question.
I do, actually. So it sounded from the conversation like the universal vote by mail really is the gold standard, where the ballots are automatically sent out to all voters rather than the requesting the ballot model that we have now in New York and in Pennsylvania. So I guess this is really a question for Andrew and Susan as to whether you think there is the opportunity for the universal vote by mail to come to New York, and maybe for Andrew, sort of states more on the eastern side of the country where the universal vote by mail seems less common.
So our experience at Common Cause New York and with our colleagues at the Let New York Vote Coalition is that voter reform in New York has been an incremental process. When we first formed in 2017, the laws for access to the ballot were among the most restrictive in the country. In the intervening 5 or 6 years, I think we've been able to pass some really significant changes. But as Andrew said, implementation remains a challenge. We work very closely with the boards of elections. So certainly, I think we see the early vote by mail bill as the opening towards a progression that ultimately, yes, I'm sure that New York, like most of the country, will evolve to a universal vote by mail system. And I point to Colorado as what I think of as the perfect way in which to approach this. Again, it's putting more choices and determination in the hands of the ballot. In Colorado, every voter gets their ballot by mail, but it's then up to them to decide how they want to cast it. They can fill out their ballot at home, drop it in a drop box. They can drop it off at a polling place. There are vote centers, there's early voting. People still have the ability to decide for themselves if they prefer to vote in person. They still have the ability to do that. I think the strongest possible system is one where you have all modalities for voting available to all voters. And our goal at Common Cause New York, and I think I can speak for the Let New York Vote Coalition as well, is to be sure that all New York voters have that plethora of opportunities to be able to choose their leaders. We'll get there, but it's going to take some time. We're on the East Coast.
I wholeheartedly agree with everything Susan said. I mean, in terms of other states, particularly on the East Coast, I don't think there's anything stopping any state from doing it at like a philosophical level. You know, I've said this though, it is these things do need to be particularized to the needs of a community. And now you see like California and Colorado are pretty different states in terms of their populations. They've both been able to implement it. So I don't think universal vote by mail is necessarily right or wrong for any you know, state, urban, rural, size wise. I think every state has the opportunity to do that. It's a significant change. It's a significant administration or challenge for election administration. I think the election administration in every state are capable of it. But there are a lot of important things to do as well that, you know, relate to funding, relate to making sure partisans aren't able to meddle in elections. So I agree, universal vote by mail is a great change, and it's something that's important to every state. But I do want to give a shout out as well to many of the some states are passing state voting rights acts to better enforce the laws of their state to make sure everyone can vote. So I want to make sure those changes too are acknowledged and celebrated. But Neil, I definitely agree with the conceit of your question, and I echo everything Susan said.
And New York has the most robust voting rights act at the state level, I'm happy to say.
It's a very, very shocking mess.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up early. That was a great conversation. I really thank the panelists. I thank you, all of you, for joining our conversation. And I hope to see you virtually at the next one. Really appreciate your participation. And I'm going to hand it over to Neil for a couple of closing observations and comments.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you for your moderation and the tough questions, and thank you to our panel for giving us the national, the Pennsylvania, and the New York perspective on this. I just put in the chat how to reach us at GoVoteNYC. You can email info@govoteny.org for us to put you on our mailing list for future programming. We're just putting together ideas for our programming for 2024. So happy to email that out to you once we have that lined up. And also our website in order to keep up with the work that we are doing around the trusted messenger model. And that was referenced earlier in the conversation by Bishop Dwayne in terms of using trusted messengers in the video that we saw to communicate the details of the vote by mail law in Pennsylvania. And trusted messenger is really the model that we at GoVoteNYC are supporting with our grantee partners. They are all trusted messengers in their communities and neighborhoods in New York City, engaging their communities around the importance of voting and doing so through relational organizing, people to people. We also heard in the discussion today about the importance of putting voters front and center in this work. And that's very much what our grantee partners are doing, voter by voter, engaging them on the issues in their neighborhoods and communities and connecting that to the importance of voting. So thank you all for joining us, and stay tuned for our programming in 2024.